Good morning to all of you. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. The event is organized by the Bangalore International Center, Rujuvatu and Bahuvachana Trusts. Frederick Smith is Emeritus Professor of Sanskrit and Classical Indian Religions at the University of Iowa. He served in both the Department of Religious Studies and the Department of Asian and Slavic Languages and Literature, chairing the latter for 5 years. His association with India spans more than 50 years. He first came to Pune, where he earned his MA in Sanskrit from the Center for Advanced Study in Sanskrit, Pune University, in 1976. He has since lived for extended periods in Pune, Chennai, Mysore, and Braj, and later in the Himalaya near Uttarkashi. Altogether, he has spent nearly 20 years in India. Fred has researched widely across Sanskrit literature and Indian religious culture. His work includes studies of Vedic ritual texts and performance, deity and spirit possession, and the philosophy, textual traditions, and devotional practices of Vallabhacharya, founder of the Pushti Marg. He is also translating major portions of the Mahabharata and serves as editor of the Primus book series, completing the translation begun by Van Buitenen in 1970. He is the author of 3 major books, over 100 scholarly articles, and more than 200 book reviews, and has spoken at numerous conferences and universities. Now retired from the University of Iowa, he has returned to his native Santa Fe, New Mexico. His closest and longest standing companion is a parrot named Papagenu, who has been with him for 40 years. I had the rare privilege of being to Fred's home this last winter, and Papagenu is a real delight, but you can't touch him. He pecks at all visitors, but he sings Mozart too sometimes. So, Fred, that's lovely to have you here, and welcome.
My pranams to the people that set this up, namely Vivek Shampag and Ananthamurthy. I've known the family for probably 40 years. I've stayed at their house and their farm in Mysore and their apartment, Vivek's apartment in Bangalore here, many times, and had great delight. Just one little story about that. I think I really bonded with them when I was staying at their place, and we were watching the finals of the World Cup about 1990 or some such year. I can't even remember who it was that played. It might have been Argentina and Italy. And I was a nonpartisan, being an American. I had no idea who I should root for, and I can't even remember who won. But it was a great bonding experience, and it was an all-night thing because the World Cup final did not begin until about 3 o'clock in the morning. And so I've always enjoyed Bangalore. I came to Bangalore first more than 50 years ago, and every time I come, I can barely even imagine that anything survived from the old Bangalore except Koshi's restaurant, to which we went last night. But I realize it's more nostalgia there than quality, but it was fun. And with that, let me turn to my paper here, which I've titled here, Dharma and its Realms in the Mahabharata, and in the Mandakini Mahabharata, which I will explain to you, since none of you will know what that's all about. And I'll say a few words about Sri Ananthamurthy's book on called Samskara, which you've all probably read, but and seen the movie and all of that, just as I have. So let me just start here. So among what I hope to show here is that the Mahabharata is not just one thing, but it's based on trial and experience. It's different things for different people. Not only that, but the 2 millennia old Sanskrit text that we commonly refer to as the Mahabharata is but one text of this name out of many, perhaps too many to count. And certainly it has not been inventoried in the way that the multiple Ramayanas have around India. But some are written in regional languages or dialects that might differ from one village or district to the next. Each is a living and mostly oral tradition. As I've discovered in the Garhwal Himalaya, where I am actually based right now, I have a house up about 12 kilometers above Uttarkashi, up the mountainside, towards Gangotri. And that's where I stay now in India, after all my years down in these hot places. So now I'm up in a much more suitable climb for the likes of me. What I'm suggesting is that the Mahabharata has been under development for thousands of years, and it shows no sign of slowing down as more recent cultural phenomena have been integrated into it. The plot, not to mention the characters, is allowed to adopt, adapt, and accept. We can see that this is also the case in the Sanskrit Mahabharata, in which hundreds of manuscripts from throughout India and of all periods were used to compile a critical edition in the mid-20th century. The living tradition of the Mahabharata is found from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, from Dibrugarh to Dwarka. And in this talk, I'll provide an example of this, as I've said, an example from the Garhwal Himalaya that can demonstrate the textual development. That noted, the commitment to Dharma, even if its shifts are prominent, argues for continuity rather than discontinuity, which is what most people have argued. It's not irrelevant to mention that the legacy of the Mahabharata can be found everywhere, including in the work of the honored U.R. Ananthamurthy in his novel Samskara, as I'll also mention here. So, the most defining concept in the history of India is Dharma. It has multiple meanings, especially when comparing its meanings in the Mahabharata and classical Dharma Shastra with the meanings in Buddhist texts and in popular culture. It finds major venues in the discussion of polity and culture in India, where it's addressed exhaustively in scholarship throughout the world for the last 2.5 centuries. What, the Yaksha asks in the Vanaparvan of the Mahabharata, what causes the sun to rise, and what are its companions? What makes it set, and on what is it founded? Yudhishthira replied appropriately, Brahman makes the sun rise, and the gods are its companions. Dharma makes it set, and on truth it is founded. In its primary meaning of upholding order, we can see that for societies to thrive and prosper, order is to some degree necessary. Humans are uniquely designed to create, produce, construct, communicate, and destroy in ways that other beings are not, or at least are not always apparent to us, whether it's to our ultimate advantage or to our ultimate detriment. In my view, this is because we really don't understand the nature of communication processes that typify other beings, but that's not what I'm here to talk about, because I feel that all beings possess dharma in their own way. To move to the main point here, in the Sanskrit Mahabharata and in its vernacular variants, as well as in Professor Ananthamurthy's Samskara, the understanding of and problematic nature of dharma, especially in its relationship with human desire, emotion, and incomprehensible or unexpected actions, raises its head. It's likely easier for a dog or a frog to be true to its dharma than it is for a member of our own troubled species. First, let's review a bit of Mahabharata history, rather history of the Mahabharata, of the emotions and processes of moving its plot forward in ways that will always stand on shaky ground, evident from the dynamics of beauty and opposition in all of these texts. It's important to point out that it's impossible to definitively answer the most contentious and most asked question about the Mahabharata. namely its date and authorship. I'll dispatch these questions quickly, even if many in the audience in every audience I speak to, and likely this one as well, are hungry for definitive, satisfying, politically and religiously convenient and uncontroversial answers. Well, you're not going to get one. And and if you think you're going to get one from anybody, then I would have to contest that. In any case, to dispatch with this question, politically driven forces throw numbers that support the contention that the Mahabharata is 5,000 or 10,000 years old or eternal, dating to the Treta or Dwapara Yugas. Scholars who actually read these texts as part of history, however, will give you different answers. Mine is that according to early and middle Vedic texts, there appears to have been a battle around the 9th or the 10th century BCE because of discussion in the Atharva Veda and some of the early Brahmana texts of Middle Vedic texts of a powerful king named Parikshit at around that time. The battle, it appears reasonable to assume, was memorialized in oral tradition for the next 700 or 800 years, with a major story developing around it, which included the rise of Buddhism and the Hindu reaction to it. One of the most visible scholars of the Mahabharata, James Fitzgerald, sees the Mahabharata as a reaction to the Mauryas, to the Emperor Ashoka and others shortly before the text was committed to writing, which probably began about the 2nd century BCE and continued with accretions for perhaps 4 or 5 centuries. Another view, that of the late accomplished Mahabharata scholar Alf Hiltebeitel, the date of the text is much tighter, with the composition between about 180 BCE and about the turn of the millennium, but encompassing about 2 generations of scholars. This is not particularly important for us today, except to note that the text, with far more characters and philosophical and religious perspectives than were surely the case 800 years earlier, migrated into the early centuries of literacy in India towards the close of the millennium. We can't consider the Indus Valley civilization or its problematic decipherment attempts of the script in this equation. If you have any questions about that, ask me later. For its authorship, the Sanskrit text is in general pretty direct, even if odd and difficult locutions can be found throughout the text. Some scholars have argued for a Kshatriya Sanskrit at the time, but the final redaction appears to have been by members of the Bhrigu clan, assuredly Brahmins. Politically motivated forces in India will insist that the long-lived sage Vyasa recited it, and it was written down by Ganesha, who tore off one of his tusks in order to use it as a writing implement. Otherwise, the much less interesting and less spectacular possibility is that the composers and reciters and redactors were scholars, literate bards, and philosophers who worked over several generations or even centuries. It's not going to be very interesting to a lot of people for me to say that. No new theories there. My own minor role in this truly epic history is to prepare an annotated translation of the last 5 Padvans of the Pune critical edition of the Mahabharata. This is part of the continuation of the series, as Shadid mentioned, translated inaugurated by the late University of Chicago Sanskrit professor J.A.B. von Buitenen, who published 3 volumes of the first 5 Padvans in the annotated edition from in 1973, 75, and 1978, and he died in 1979 with nothing left on his desk. Von Buitenen's student James Fitzgerald continued his mentor's work with the publication of the Stri Padvan and the first 2 divisions of the Shanti Padvan, consisting of the Apad Dharma and the Raja Dharma sections in 2004, and will publish the Moksha Dharma section in a separate long volume. Oh, it keeps getting postponed, probably by the middle of 2026. But Professor Fitzgerald has worked on this for more than 50 years. The remaining Padvans, 9 in number, will be published by Primus Books in Delhi, and now the best Indological publisher in India, under the sure-handed guidance of Sri Bholanath Verma, a tough taskmaster and exceptionally erudite publisher who knows everything about the business, from marketing to the minutiae of page layout. My own responsibility or dharma in this is to serve as chief editor of the 5 volumes, including my own, which will complete this truly epic undertaking. And gods know when that's going to be done, because von Buitenen published the first volume in 73, And who knows when our last volume is going to come out. Hopefully, before we all move on to another Janma. Previous translations remain available, of course, beginning with the one by the capable and literate Bengali scholar Kishori Mohan Ganguly, who worked assiduously for 13 years on this from 1883 to 1896. This was not just assiduousness, but he worked at lightning speed, considering that there was no critical edition, and he had to work with manuscripts, mostly those of the Bombay text, as it was called, with the commentary by the 16th century Maharashtrian Pandit Nilakanta Chaturdhara. Most of the complete translations are scholarly in the sense that the authors try to philologically responsible and maintain a healthy dialogue with previous translators. Some of them, however, do not, are philologically irresponsible and do not look at other people's work. I find this all too frequent, that people start the same projects over and over and over again without any reference to any dialogue with previous works that's been done. Now, some of the translators, as I say, are philologically irresponsible. They're tone deaf to the interaction between the Sanskrit language and the cultural nuances of the epic. There's an unfortunate tendency to be neglectful of their duty as translators in this way. I've written about this extensively, and that's all I'm going to say about it right now. But some of these translations are politely labeled idiosyncratic. Okay, we can leave it at that. It's more important to ask what it is that makes the Mahabharata move, that gives it life, what propels it forward. The easiest answer is curses and boons, possession and agency, power and polity, corruption and incorruptible honesty, sacrifice and generosity, the interventions of gods and miraculous powers, violence without any discourse on bloodshed, regal enmity, geographical discovery and absorption, and lists of royal lineages. And okay, now I don't have to say anymore. Now you know about it. And all of this is covered over by a thin veneer of Sankhya philosophy. It's like a quarter of an inch deep. And below that, it's all sorts of much more interesting things. Not that Sankhya is not interesting, because it is. But among the curses and boons, let me just give you a quick synopsis of these things. Curses and boons. Well, one of them is when Kadru, a Naga woman, cursed her own sons to be incinerated in a sarpayajna, a snake sacrifice that would be performed by Janamejaya. The sarpayajna is the outer layer in a series of frame stories that enfold the Mahabharata. Vinita was Kadru's sister and Garuda's mother when Kadru's sons were born. Vinita lost her patience and broke one of her two externally gestating eggs. Her son Aruna was not quite fully developed, so he cursed Vinita to become a slave of Kadru's for 500 years. In another story, the Brahmin sage Shakti requested some vegetarian food from King Kalmashapada. That was in the Adi Padvan, and the king made the Brahmana wait until midnight, then ordered his cook to serve human flesh to the Brahmana. The Brahmana became infuriated when he discovered that he would serve human flesh. He then cursed the king to become a voracious cannibal. Those are just two of hundreds of curses in the Mahabharata, which kind of makes it fun. And among the boons, after scorching the Khandava forest, the deity Agni bestowed on Arjuna Indra's weapons, including a bow named Gandiva, 2 quivers with unending arrows, a chariot with a flag of a monkey, a Kapidhwaja, and to Krishna, he gave a discus and eternal friendship with Arjuna. So I could go on with all that, and it might be interesting, but I will proceed. As for possession, I wrote a big book on this a couple of decades ago in which I focused more on historical descriptions than on ethnographic observation, even if I did not neglect the ubiquity of possession phenomena that you can find virtually everywhere in India. Bhuta Vidya, the knowledge of spirits, is a very big subject in classical and modern India, including in medical literature. But in the Mahabharata, it's really very, very ubiquitous. It's always there. The five Pandava brothers were not simply humans in their birth, but also bore the essence of the deities who possessed them. For example, Indra of Arjuna, Dharma of Yudhishthira, Vayu of Bhima, and so on. And then there's the famous case of Nala in his own mini Mahabharata, who was possessed by the spirit of Kali, the Dark Age, which ruined Nala's life and his relationship with his beautiful wife, Damayanti. You all know that story from age 3 or probably like that. And so I won't go into that. I have a long story here of a possession episode in the Mahabharata, which probably some of you know, I'll just go through it here. So in the Anushasana Padvan, the 13th of the 18 books, Vipula Bhargava is assigned by his guru Deva Sharman to protect his wife Ruchi while he's away performing a yajna. Deva Sharman is worried that the lecherous Indra will make sexual advances on Ruchi unless she were protected by the yogic powers of Vipula, who would enter Ruchi's body to stave off the psychic advances of Indra. Rather than leave Ruchi as easy prey for the unscrupulous Indra, the master shapeshifter, who was known to be enamored of the beautiful Ruchi, Deva Sharman assigned his loyal pupil Vipula the job of protecting Ruchi in his absence. Vipula, we are reminded, was an ascetic whose senses were under control. He acquiesced to his guru's command, and after Deva Sharman's departure, he pondered how he would accomplish his task. His difficulty was that he knew Indra could not be kept out by erecting physical barriers because of his prowess at shapeshifting, nor could he be defeated in one-on-one combat. Thus, he decided to possess Ruchi, disabling her mind. He remained there in wait, reasoning that through his yogic strength, he could prevent Ruchi from succumbing to Indra's attractions. He then entered her body, as the Mahabharata is careful to inform us, with his mind controlled, directed only towards Dharma, the Vedas, and his own and his guru's austerities. This excessive emphasis on Brahminical purity informs the reader that possession is acceptable in these circumstances. After taking a seat next to Ruchi, Vipula gained her attention by telling her stories. He then stared into her eyes, normally a seductive gesture, uniting the rays of light emanating from her eyes with those emanating from his. Through the open channel of the eyes, Vipula proceeds to enter her body as wind enters an empty space. Then, entering her limbs and face with the corresponding parts of his subtle body, the sage Vipula remained with her unmoving, invisible, like a shadow. I could say a few words more about this later because I've seen some modern, in modernity, I've seen this same procedure being used in certain Mahabharata performances in the Himalaya. But I can talk about that later. So he was able to constrain her entire body to protect her from Indra's certain advances because she was now stripped of her volition. And predictably, Indra appeared, having lain in wait for his prey like Kali's stalking Nala. He donned the most exquisitely seductive form and met with the sight not only of the beautiful Ruchi, but with Vipula as well, unmoving, his eyes frozen, still as a picture. The lustful Indra, ignoring the odd company, decided to make his move. His sweet, enticing words caught Ruchi's attention, which Vipula suppressed, unknown to Indra. So she attempted to respond positively to Indra, but this merely intensified the luminous Vipula's yogic power, which he deployed to restrain her sense organs. Thus, Indra was caught off guard when she responded to his seductive beckoning with elegant Sanskrit, "Oh, what is the purpose in your coming? Ho, kim agamani krityam," she said in chaste Sanskrit. Suddenly, Indra caught on and resorted to his own power of divine sight, Divyena Chakshusha. He saw Vipula in possession of Ruchi's body like a reflection in a mirror. He trembled, frightened, being cursed by the young sage. Vipula then returned to his own body, and rather than pronounce another curse on Indra, reminded him of a previous curse leveled by Gautama for just such behavior towards his wife Ahalya, and gave him a severe tongue lashing, after which the king of the gods disappeared. Realizing the greatness of the power of Vipula and of his guru Deva Sharman. This would be the end of the story, except that after several other adventures in the lives of Vipula and Devasharman, Vipula became aware that he had committed a sin of omission, equivocation. He understood that he had neglected to inform Devasharman exactly how he had protected Ruchi from Indra. He was not confident that Devasharman would approve the method to which he had resorted, namely possession. This omission Vipula learned through inadvertently overhearing casual conversation around him, condemned him to hell. Devasharman, however, learned of Vipula's method from the day, from the night, and from the 6 seasons, and eventually confronted him with it. Vipula confessed, and Devasharman forgave him. In fact, it was never problematic for Devasharman because he recognized that Vipula's maintenance of self-control while possessing his wife was a commendable yogic accomplishment and completely in accord with the highest dharma. This small matter cleared up. The 3 of them, Devasharman, Ruchi, and Vipula, ascended to heaven and enjoyed great bliss. So how does this square with dharma? We're accustomed to thinking about dharma in terms of the Bhagavad Gita. When Arjuna was confused about his own dharma, shall I go to war against my kinsman, asks Arjuna. Yes, Krishna answers, because you're a Kshatriya, so act like one. What does this say or not say about the fixity of Varnashrama dharma 2,000 years ago? In my opinion, having studied this stuff for half a century, it seems that Varnashrama dharma was at that time weaker in practice than in theory. Indeed, it might still be weaker in practice than in theory. Theory is out there, but practice, we see all kinds of stuff going on. The Manusmriti was composed around the same time as the Mahabharata, but then, as now, it circulated among a fairly limited elite and was not enforced outside of those communities. The Manusmriti, or the laws of Manu, was never a text used in legal jurisprudence. That was reserved for texts like the Yajnavalkya Smriti and more compendious tomes like the Chaturvarga Chintamani and certain others through the first millennium CE. Most historians, in fact, see that the caste boundaries were not fixed until around the end of the first millennium CE, roughly an entire millennium after Manu and the Mahabharata were composed. We can see, however, from the burgeoning number of castes and from evidence that social mobility at the time was much more fluid than we can imagine today, the caste established exclusively through birth and occupation, which we errantly assume to have been the case since the Rig Veda, mentioned in 1090 of the Rig Veda, is a misconception, albeit it's an easy one to make. As for modernity, which must be our crucial concern, let's turn to 2 topics. The first is the Mahabharata in Garhwal, and one of the Mahabharatas at least. The one in question, which we might call the Agastya Muni or Mandakini Mahabharata, because it has been sung by bards from there, about 20 kilometers up the Mandakini River from Rudraprayag on the road to Kedarnath, was written down by one of the bards in about 1985 at the behest of Dr. D.R. Purohit of Garhwal University in Srinagar, Garhwal, an hour and a half down the Alaknanda River from Rudraprayag. The Mandakini joins the Alaknanda, in fact, at Rudraprayag. It's one of the many sangams that compose the Ganga. Purohitji has been my mentor in all things Garhwali for 20 years. He himself grew up in an impoverished village without roads or electricity in the mountains well above Rudraprayag. He did not even have a pair of shoes until he was 10 years old. But he did have a facility for theater, performance, and bardic singing. He has more than his fair share of natural charisma and can tell a detailed story with complete clarity and good humor and riveting in 5 minutes or 2 hours. It's all just depends on who's there. That's the bardic genius. And he became a professor of both folklore and English at Garhwal University and has traveled around the area extensively and still does, with his own Garhwali language theater troupe as part of his mission to revive Garhwali drama, song, literature, and culture. I've stayed at his house in Srinagar often, and in about 2012, I discovered in an Almirah a long text of about 1,000 pages of neat and legible handwritten Garhwali in a large unmarked pile of lined, dog-eared A4 notebooks. I pestered Purohitji about this for several years. Finally, he allowed me to scan them in 2017. It It's not complete, he said, because the bard refused to write down the Karna Vadha section, the death of Karna, which is one of the most important sections in the epic, particularly in Garhwal, where Karna is the most important Mahabharata character. The Western Himalayas are the epicenter of Mahabharata culture, which I can explain later, if you'd like. I'm still trying to get the last remaining bard in Agastya Muni, which is this small town, to recite that section for me. It will take a team of people, not just Purohitji and me, and perhaps a lack of rupees, to prevail upon him to do this. But that's kind of a different story. What I'll read now are a couple of excerpts from this, translated by Purohitji, William Sachs of University of Heidelberg, and me. We've been working on this for several years. We kind of dried up during COVID years, but I was just in Heidelberg a couple of times this summer, and I think we're going to get back on track with it. But we got to get Purohitji with us. I can't recapture the magic of bardic recitation. Its rhythm, poetics, and electric interactivity with an audience that sits riveted for as many as 9 hours on a rainy night, which I have seen. The frequent refrains are understood and repeated by the local villagers, rather like distantly resonant Homeric poetry in the Balkans discussed by Milman Parry and Albert Lord in the mid-20th century. I've edited this strictly for clarity, adding a bit of context and rendering it in story form that's familiar to us today. The manuscript was unclear in places, and some of the narrative was out of order, probably because the bard was not practiced at writing down what he had memorized. So he would think of something and then write it down and then come back to think of another verse from that same passage, like, half an hour later, and write that down on another page and so on. So it was difficult to piece it all together. So I felt it necessary to do a little bit of editing in this story. First, however, let me give you a breakdown of this Agastya Muni Mahabharata. Purohitji and I have divided the text into 172 episodes, which are to be recited and performed over 62 days or nights. A total of 35 of the episodes, or 20% of the text, are familiar from the Sanskrit Mahabharata. 34 episodes, another 20%, show partial similarity. 11 episodes, or a little over 6%, show remote similarity. And 92 episodes, or 53% of the text, are entirely of local origin or came in with other epic passages from Rajasthan or Kashmir, with no connection to the Sanskrit version of 2,000 years ago. All of this will be completely unfamiliar to you, unless you happen to be a Garhwali speaker in the Western Himalayas, and at that, only the dialect spoken along the Mandakini River. Are there any of you here? I doubt it. Okay. It's all, however, assuredly Mahabharata. The classical Sanskrit version captured in the text in a local isolated version, even if it appeared in many parts of India, as we can see from the excisions made by the editors of the Pune Critical Edition from 1933 to 1966, or from looking at the Kumbhakonam edition of the Southern Recension in the early 20th century, and from the Kolkata edition published between 1836 and 1840. These are the editions that were considered to be classical. In addition, the Mahabharata continued to grow and evolve in every corner of India in regional and local languages. So we're incredibly fortunate to have the Mahabharata in its arrested development, which is the Sanskrit version of 2,000 years ago. But again, it's not the only one. So now here's my story of the day. All right, not just the Ruchi and Deva Sharman and Vipula, but this is the more interesting story, because none of you have ever heard it before. I'm assuming that you haven't. Okay, this is from episodes 97 to 105 of the 172 episodes. So Sushmi is actually a feminine name, which means soft or delightful, like that. But it's a masculine character here. So Sushmi was the son of Konsa and Maya Mohi. Everyone had already been killed, including Konsa. So Sushmi, naked and scared, went to the king. He then raised an army that destroyed Krishna's palace in Muhur. Krishna struck back with the help of the Pandavas and set out to destroy Sushmi. The capital of Sushmi's region, Garh Kangura, which means a fort with bas-relief sculpture on it, was ruled by a demon or Danava named Malasti. Eventually, Sushmi was slaughtered and the Ashwamedha was performed. Okay, that's like the short story. Now, let's tell the real story here. Back in the beginning, however, Sushmi was born and grew unstoppably into a powerful demon. He grew in an hour, the size that a normal baby would grow in several days. By the time he was 12, he was a giant, so immense that he destroyed everything, including agricultural fields. He threw flint at women fetching water. He tormented people needlessly. Because of this, the Sabha, the court, met in Garkangura. They agreed that they had brought up a bad child. Their solution was to set loose upon Sushmi a large male bull, Bela, that lived in a chani, or chan, it's the Gadwali word for a wooden, a heavy wooden barn and storage unit. A temporary shed here for cows, bulls, and buffaloes. A letter was sent to the herder of the chani, ordering him to kill Sushmi along with his cattle. When the herdsman read the letter, he set his bulls on Sushmi. However, Sushmi, aware that he was being attacked, responded by uprooting trees, which killed the bulls and the herdsman. He then set the herdsman's chani on fire, sliced the legs off the bulls, and threw them into the court of Malasti. The court was forced to admit, the Sabha was forced to admit that their project had failed. The Sabha then decided to set 2 rams loose on Sushmi. Again, a letter was sent to the shepherd who owned the rams. Just as before, Sushmi uprooted a large Bhojapatra tree and killed the rams, burned the chandi, cut off the legs of the rams, and threw them into the court of Malasti. The Sabha's third plot against the rams was to take the remainder of Malasti's cows into the fields to graze them and then set them on Sushmi. Maya Mohi, Sushmi's mother, tried to stop him because even she did not trust Sushmi's intention. When they were in the forest, Sushmi broke the heads and legs of the other herdsmen. There was a large seesaw, or beju, in the forest, resembling the one used for children to play on. It was unusual, however, because it was a pool beju, a seesaw made of flowers, because while playing on it, they would swing their heads from side to side like a seesaw. All the herdsmen were on one side of the beju, and Sushmi was on the other side. The young herdsman asked Sushmi to tell them the name of their father, or they wouldn't play with him. The name of his father, or they wouldn't play with him. He returned to his mother in embarrassment and asked her who was his father. He told her that the other boys were teasing him, calling him a bastard because he didn't know his father. He always swore allegiance to his mother and humbly requested her to tell him the name of his father. Ashamed, he laid down in a dark room where his mother found him, crying. She told him it was Kansa, and he had a great empire. It was because of Lakshminarayan, which is Krishna, usually called Lakshminarayan here, that he was killed, but that he spared her because she was pregnant. Lakshminarayan stole her clothes so that she would wander about naked in Garkangura. She gave birth to Sushmi there. In order to honor your father, she told Sushmi, you must seek revenge on Krishna. The mother of the demon Malasti said, listen, Malasti, Sushmi is a demon and needs the army of Garkangura to defeat Krishna. But he also needs help from the army, the Poj of Jalandhari. That was also sought as allies by the Pandavas. Next, Lula Bhandari, which really means the one-armed cook, one-armed disabled cook or storekeeper, arrived in Garkangura on a giant palki or palanquin and asked, why did you invite me here? He was told that we need a large army and you need to supply them with provisions. Jarasandha, an enemy of the Pandavas, was also invited to participate and was told that Sushmi needs to revenge his father's humiliation. As a result, Jarasandha decided to go to Krishna's palace in hot, dry Muhur. The 4 armies were led by Sushmi, who turned out to be a natural general. He first destroyed the palace and the gardens, which Adinath Shambhu, or Shiva, discovered. He spun his damaru and announced that an army of the gods would be coming. Sushmi and his allies fled back to Garkangura. Krishna returned to Jayantapuri, capital of the Pandavas. The armies in Jayantapuri then rose to fight the three armies of Sushmi, Jarasandha, Malasti, and Jalandhari. During this battle, Krishna told Arjuna that Sushmi could only die by his army, arrows, and hand. Krishna approached Arjuna, which motivated the Pandava army to touch Krishna's feet. Krishna told them that Sushmi has destroyed the Muhud palace and that he has predestined Arjuna to kill the demons. Kunti convinced Yudhishthira that the Pandavas must defeat Sushmi to avenge Krishna. She asked Bhima to tell Duryodhana that his army is also needed. Bhima approached Duryodhana and honorifically touched his feet, then prostrated at the feet of Gandhari, Dronacharya, and Ashwatthama. Because the armies of both Jayantapuri and Hastinapura, the capital cities of the Pandavas and the Kauravas respectively, were needed, and because Narayana was the family deity of both, they decided to invite Dushasana. They approached the citizens for permission to stage the Yuddha, the battle, across an extensive stretch of land. A jagad, or a nocturnal session designed to awaken, the word jagad has a sense of awakening, to awaken the deity to the audience, is interposed here. We have to remember that this is performed over 62 nights. And so they would intersperse to have a jagad on one of those nights. But there were jagads that were interspersed throughout. Jagad is part of the culture of Kumaon and parts of Garhwal. I can talk more about that later. In this jagad, the intention and the summary of what they were trying to do was sung. Instructions were given in case the Pandavas lose. Broken bowstrings were replaced, bowls for cooking were soldered, and the army was equipped. The battle flag was raised, drums resounded, the entire Kaurava army, including Dronacharya, touched Krishna's feet. The armies were assembled. In order to maintain the honor of the Muhud palace, the Pandavas decided there must be a war. Bhima conscripted the forces of Jayantapuri, while Kunti ordered provisions. Yudhishthira and Duryodhana mounted their chariots at the front of their armies. Because of the colors of the army dress, it looked like a rhododendron or borange forest. Have any of you ever been up to the Himalayas in like March, April, and see big rhododendron forests, 100-foot high rhododendron trees? Well, that's what this looked like, okay? Local ecology comes throughout this Mahabharata. So many were the swords in their hands that it looked like a lightning storm. Lakshminarayan then staged an ordeal that the Pandavas must pass in order to proceed. He sat in front of the army announcing that he had been affected by kushtaroga, which is leprosy. Krishna being afflicted by leprosy, okay? Blood is streaming down my body and it's covered with flies. He said that if Sushmi is not killed, he would be humiliated. I'll run to a tirtha and become a beggar. He told Yudhishthira to defeat the army and to bring a Lankavali mango, a mango from Sri Lanka, which will cure the kushtaroga. Dharmaraja asked Arjuna to go to Lanka to find this mango to cure Krishna. He is meanwhile holding all the time a Panchamukhi bana, a five-faced arrow with great destructive force. Soon after he left Jayantapuri, Arjuna tried to cross the Ramganga river, which is up in those parts, but found that it was not possible. The river was guarded by a man or spirit, it wasn't clear to me, a spirit named Avichan. He possessed an arrow called Avichan Bana, shaped like an instrument for measuring oil. I'm not quite sure what that was supposed to be. The arrow had a multi-pronged tip, like the head of a cobra. Avichan declared that if the blessings of Lakshminarayan, Kunti, and others had real power, and if Arjuna's intention was true, the arrow would hit the target. Because of the Ramganga could not be crossed, Avichan would fire his arrow into the waters. And if Arjuna's intentions and blessings were true, he could then cross a river of arrows, a Bana Setu, that the single-pronged arrow created. When the arrow flew into the sky, it looked like a tempest in the month of Vaishak, like the rain in Shravan. Arjuna succeeded in crossing the bridge of arrows, the Bana Setu, and was unimpeded the rest of the way to Lanka. Finally, after arriving in Lanka, Arjuna encountered Hanuman, okay, who asked him to try to lift his tail, which Hanuman said he was unable to move. He added that he could only accept Arjuna's legitimacy if he belonged to a real Jat and Tat, to a well-regarded clan and place. My Jat is Pandava and my Tat is Jayantapuri, said Arjuna. Hanuman asked, why did you then come to my station if you have Lakshminarayana as your patron? Arjuna tells him that Lakshminarayana has leprosy and that he needs a mango as a cure. Hanuman told him that he should follow a path to Lankavali that branches into 4 roads. He will be able to select the right path if he remembers the gods and keeps his faith. Arjuna finally reached the garden of Suvarnika, who also asked about his Jat and Tat, about his mother and father. My Jat is Pandava, my Tat is Jayantapuri, my mother is Kunti, my brother is Bhima. Suvarna falls in love and agrees that all of this is good. The Sas, or mother-in-law, then took him to her residence to rest on a sutri palang, a woven cotton cot. Suvarna then poured oil from the pot into her hands and massaged Arjuna. Sex is assuredly suggested here, after which Arjuna felt relaxed. He then stayed in the house of Suvarnika for that night at least. The next morning, following prescribed pre-dawn practices, Arjuna and the others awakened with the rising sun. They took their morning baths, applied mustard seed or sarson paste to their heads, performed the Sandhya Vandana, applied forehead marks that resembled the number 12, Dwadasha Tilaka it's called, enjoyed 5 varieties of food with 36 flavors, including sweets and rice mixed with yogurt and turmeric. Suvarnika placed the golden pitcher on a small raised platform and sat Arjuna on a stool higher than his breakfast plate, which was placed on the platform. He was then served. After they enjoyed the meal, the Anaprasadam, he dressed in divine raiments or divyanga. Arjuna informed Suvarnika that he must leave for the Lankavali grove to fetch the healing mango. But to do that, he would need a letter of introduction from her to present to her brother, King Vibhishana, who lived there. She wrote the letter, and Arjuna safely tucked it into his lower garment. He then boarded a 4-horsed chariot bound for that Lankavali grove. He was soon granted an audience with Vibhishana, who examined the message from his sister Suvarnika. Vibhishana told Arjuna he could take an entire branch of these mangoes. Arjuna responded somewhat defiantly, I'm not a thief. I can carry only so much as I can carry. Vibhishana gave him an armful of mangoes and said that he should take them all. He told Arjuna to return to his place by once again crossing the Banasetu on a Ramaganga. Only after returning to his palace, however, should he dismantle the Banasetu. After he returned and took apart the Banasetu, Arjuna returned to another house belonging to Suvarnika, this one near Jayantapuri, where he stayed for some time. This is how Arjuna returned with the mangoes to cure Krishna's Kushtaroga. He had accomplished the impossible by collecting the Lankavali mango. He then follows an interlude in which Arjuna and Suvarnika enjoy a bit of lovemaking. Finally, Arjuna departed for the war. Suvarnika wanted to accompany him, but Arjuna vetoed that idea, emphasizing to her that it's too dangerous. Their mission was to kill the young giant Sushmi, and that his armies were very good. He promised Suvarnika he would return for her. She brought Arjuna the 4-horse chariot, and after a ritual of departure, Arjuna arrived at the scene of the battle. There he once again encountered Hanuman, who asked Arjuna how his journey went. Arjuna said it was successful because he secured the Lankavali mango. Hanuman then said, listen, Arjuna, whenever you're in deep crisis, tickle the soft sole of my foot or give me the hiccups, and I'll answer immediately. Arjuna conducted himself with a finely tuned sense of protocol and cleanliness. Finally, he reached Krishna and presented him with the Lankavali mango. Krishna, however, replied that the mango was stale, so the demon Sushmi would not be killed. Instead, Krishna ordered Arjuna to return to Jayantapuri and Hastinapura. Arjuna countered, telling Krishna that he can't run away from a battle. It would be a great embarrassment. Arjuna asked Krishna to suggest another remedy. Go and ask Kunti to smash the stale mango, Krishna said. Out of that, a Hatakali mango will arise. That was a little bit unclear to me, but it turns out to be a mango that would reproduce itself. One with 5 hands or faces. Only then will the deformity of my body be removed. Krishna requested Arjuna to go to Bhima and ask him to fetch Kunti. He did that. Kunti asked if Sushmi had been killed. Arjuna told Kunti the whole story, that Sushmi was still alive because the Lankavali mango was stale when it arrived, so Krishna would not give him permission to kill Sushmi. The stale mango was then fried in oil in a cauldron. A cow dung or gomaya bowl was made and clean milk was poured into it, after which the cooked mango pulp was added. Yudhishthira, who was present, declared that if Lakshminarayan is true, and then the miracle of the mango must then materialize, that a sprout will appear on the mango. It then appeared just like that. A sprout appeared. Bhishma then swore, if I'm the son of Vayu, another leaf will sprout. Arjuna said the same thing, that if he's the son of Indra, another seedling will sprout. Then Sahadeva swore similarly, if I'm the real son of Pandu, then let there be more sprouting of fruit. Kunti then declared it to be a tree. And Bhima then climbed that tree and brought the mango to Lakshminarayan, dropping it in his mouth. Bhima prayed that if one mango drops into the mouth of Lakshminarayana, it then would fall directly into the mouth of Narayana, the creator. And it worked, and Krishna's Kushtaroga disappeared. Okay, that's the story. Okay. And if you have ever heard that story, then I would be surprised, but let me know. Because all kinds of things are possible in the world. That's the, I have to say I enjoyed working on that. Because it's just so unique and unusual. When are you gonna hear stuff like that? And most of this, as I say, most of this text is, since the Bard gave it to Purohitji in 1985, this is the first time it has ever been looked at, was by Purohitji, me, and William Sachs in Heidelberg. We spent like a few months in Heidelberg just before COVID, working on this text, just trying to figure out what was going on. And it was great fun for us to do that, even though it was winter. Now, I wanted to say a few words here. I don't know what time it is. Do we have some time left? Shut it? Okay. How much time left? Half an hour? Gotcha, okay. So I want to say a few words now about Ananthamurthy's Samskara and kind of tie it in with some of this stuff. Because what the novel really highlights is religious hypocrisy, tradition versus change, and the caste system within the Brahmin community, with some of the principal themes being mortality and ritual purity, class, devotion, desire, guilt, moral decay, petty squabbling, and the binding forces of caste and community. I'm sure that for this audience, I don't need to recapitulate or summarize the plot. What I see that's relevant to what I'm talking about here is, first of all, the way that caste and varnashrama dharma were solidified, indeed ossified, well after the Sanskrit Mahabharata was composed, but which operates on a scale and with contestations that are barely visible in the Gadwali Mahabharata. Ananthamurthy's novel has no salvific figure like the idealized Rama, the flawed, powerful, and scheming Krishna, or a devotional figure like the eccentric and beloved simian Hanuman. Although the Sanskrit Mahabharata has moments of humor, irony, and unpredictability, the Gadwali Mahabharata is first and foremost fun. People really enjoy it. They don't sit there just to be lectured at or told that this is the way you should be, but they go there with the sole purpose of having fun. There was one night I attended one of these in a little village about 4 or 5 kilometers north of a place called Guptakashi, which is up the Mandakini towards Gaurikund, towards the Kedarnath. And it was raining. It started about 9 at night and ended about 6 in the morning. And there were like 300 people there. And it was cold and it was raining and everybody was totally riveted. The bard was one of these typical bardic figures from the Himalayas with a big mustache. And, these are the people who are the shamans. And he would like recite for like half an hour, 45 minutes, and then have a couple of cigarettes and a cup of chai, and then start over again. And it went until like 6 in the morning like that. And everybody it was just fun. And it was cold and it was raining. And that kind of cold and rain led to, and the parts of the Mahabharata, this is Mahabharata, remind you, that what he was telling stories of what farmers do in different months of the year, like what they do in the month of Shravan, what they do in the month of Vaishak, what they do in the month of Magha, and so on. And to them, it's Mahabharata, okay? Which means it is Mahabharata. Who am I to say that it's not? And anyway, so the purpose of their Mahabharata is to enjoy. And there is a little bit of Maramare, you see Sushmi and all of that stuff, and the eventual defeat of the demons and like that. But it's definitely the purpose is to enjoy their heritage, their culture. Now, Samskara, rather, it's a serious novel, one that highlights the anxieties of a social system that should have aged out. I mean, we think that this social system should have aged out by now. What is this? Middle of the 21st century. So we see an early version of this social system in the Sanskrit Mahabharata and shadows of it in the Gadwali Mahabharata. After reflecting on the deep history of Mahabharata phenomenon in India, and the very fact that an enormous quantity of both Sanskrit and vernacular literature is based on the epic or on parts of it, I see that Ananthamurthy, deliberately or otherwise, writes from within the tradition of the moral anxieties presented in the classical Sanskrit text, with its repeated and conscious infidelities, its flawed heroes, its ambiguity towards caste and class, in spite of the admonitions against Varnasankara, or the mixing of caste in the first chapter of the Gita, and 100 ambiguities. Ananthamurthy captures the pain, confusion, and human frailty evident in nearly every Mahabharata character, in either the Sanskrit or the Gadwali versions. No one is to be idealized, although our sympathies are clearly with Chandri and even with Praneshacharya's dilemma, whose conflicts are not far from what we see in the Mahabharata, and not far from our own, where we find souls that are alternately flawed and noble, the most thoroughly noble being, in my view, Karuna and Vidura. Somebody just asked me that question yesterday, the day before, here in Bangalore. They said, "What's your favorite characters in the Mahabharata?" Was it one of you guys? I don't know. But my favorite characters were Karuna and Vidura, and which I can go into later. But both of whom had mixed birth heredity. In conclusion here, in sum, the classical or the Sanskrit Mahabharata of 2,000 years ago is a compendium of human frailty, strength, beauty, horror, love, and fully intertwined in the lives of both the Pandavas and the Kauravas, with unseen and divine forces all around them, if mixed with evanescent results. The Gadwali Mahabharata is also an extended play on divinity, if on a macrocosmic level, with very human, if endearingly innocent and unexpected human activity. Sushmi was demonic in a way you could sympathize. Like Ghatotkacha in the Sanskrit Mahabharata or Praneshacharya in Samskara. They were their own heroes and their own nemesis, seemingly helplessly caught in the webs of fate that they themselves created. Conflicts over Dharma abound in the Mahabharata. We need not recall all or even most of them. Two that come to mind immediately are Arjuna's distress over killing Karna, while the latter is through the wheel on his chariot against the rules of Kshatriya Dharma. Another is the episode of the half-gold mongoose at the end of the Ashwamedika Parvan, when the virtues of selfless generosity on the part of a poverty-stricken family that survives on gleaning is found to be superior to the ostentatious wealth of the royal family that had just performed an Ashwamedha. In Samskara, Chandri, who feels more love than lust towards Praneshacharya, the opposite of his feelings, sees to it that Naranappa's body is cremated, albeit by a Muslim, rather than leaving it to rot further under the paralytic rain of Brahminical Dharma. I could say much more, but this should suffice to illustrate the point that the three texts I've discussed here are related, or at least intertextually, meaning that they share a web of cultural understandings. The key components to this intertextuality are an understanding of dharma, an intuition for social structure, and a familiarity with the culturally defined emotions. Let me offer one further thought as a partial answer to the question of dharma and the character of truth in the Sanskrit and Gadwali Mahabharatas, which could as well apply to Samskara. The Indian socio-political system, based on local conceptions of dharma, is consistent with India's religious background, founded as it was on integrated constructions of underlying realities that express what all South Asian religions in one way or another agree is fundamental truth. It's not important that the Mahabharata's central problem is reconciling the violence that's an inevitable aspect of pravritti dharma with the philosophical ideals of nivritti dharma, the external as opposed to the internal. Regardless of where one stands on this issue, what we see repeatedly in the Sanskrit and Gadwali Mahabharatas is the truth, whether ultimate or conditional, is a matter of hewing oneself closely to this truth, especially in a matter of speech, expressing that truth. In other words, speech itself is a generator of truth, an idea that dates to the earliest Vedic texts, because when grounded in truth, rita or satya, speech transcends the ephemeral and insubstantial character of sound. The manifestation of truth can then become an automatic response when it's spoken out, with the intention, when the intention is pure and unvarnished. The 47th sutra of the first chapter of the Yoga Sutras, which says, Ritambana Tatra Prajna, expresses this, that once you have captured a certain level of realization, then truth will naturally flow through your expressions. Truth speaking in this way is called Satyakriya in Sanskrit, found in Indian textuality. It is speech as an act of truth, which must be stated correctly. Whatever a person fully supported by truth expresses must eventually materialize. This has been the subject of a lot of Indological study in the last century and a half. And we saw it here in the Gadwali Mahabharata. Speaking the truth, then there's statements throughout that story I read that where if you speak this out, then it'll happen. If you put the right bana and shoot it in the right direction, then you're going to have the bana setu and so on. Two examples from the Sanskrit Mahabharata, which, and there's too many instances to count, are cited. I'll just cite two of them. One is found in the Karana Pavaran, where Arjuna declares, if I've tormented myself through austerities and have satisfied my seniors, if I've listened to what my well-wishers have taught me, through which truth, anena satyena, through which this truth, let this arrow slay my armored enemy, Karna, and bring me victory. I have the whole Sanskrit here, but again, Krishna declares to Uttara, the wife of Abhimanyu, who was the son of Arjuna, the wife of the late Abhimanyu, who was the son of Arjuna, that through the truth of his speech act, the stillborn Parikshit will come to life. That's in the Ashramedika Pava. In the Mandakini Mahabharata episode, we saw that Avichan declared that if the blessings of Lakshminarayan, Kunti, and others had real power, and if Arjuna's intention is true, then this arrow will hit its target. And again, Yudhishthira, who was present, declared that if Lakshminarayana is true to the miracle, then the miracle of the mango must materialize, that a sprout will appear on the mango. Bhima then swore, if I'm the son of Vayu, another leaf will sprout, and so on. We do not find an equivalent statement in Samskara, but we do find that perhaps the only guileless character in the novel, Chandri, whose actions are decisive, comes closest to the ideal of dharmic rectitude. This is not because she acts consciously to adhere to rule-bound dharma, but because of her character, but because her character is unimpeachable regardless of the fact that she's been thrown into a dharmic maelstrom by the forces around her. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. So I've heard it said, and upon reflection, I feel perhaps there's some truth to it, that the Pandavas followed the path of Dharma very rigidly prior to the Kurukshetra, whereas the Kauravas were very, proceeded on the path of adharma. Whereas during Kurukshetra, the Pandavas were probably guilty of a little bit of adharma, probably guided by Krishna as well. So do you agree? I mean, for example, Drona, Yudhishthira killing Drona, and Ashwathama, the elephant, right? Krishna pushing down the chariot of Arjuna to protect him. Yeah. And of course, Arjuna and Karna. But prior to that, they were pretty blameless in their path of dharma.
Yes, all of these characters, I think, were pretty consistent with their dharmic missions. All of them, really. I mean, just as the demonic figures were, and we have, figures like Dushasana and Shakuni, who were obviously some of the real bad characters. But they also acted very consistently with their dharmic missions, I think. So there wasn't too much problem with that, I think. Even though they had this war, and even though the Vastraharana of the Draupadi episode, I mean, that was definitely a breach of Dharma, and therefore you had this war. And the gambling, Shakuni setting up the dice, all of this. So there were some real breaches of Dharma that allowed this to transpire. I mean, I keep thinking about the world situation today and seeing all the breaches of Dharma everywhere else, and how we're just inching closer and closer to another Mahabharata. But yeah, I mean, I do agree with you that there was not really widespread, but selective breaches of Dharma that were conducted here, as far as I can see. But explain a little bit more about what you mean.
Is that prior to the Kurukshetra, right? Prior to the war, the Pandavas were fairly consistently they followed Dharma to the letter. I mean, Yudhishthira absolutely followed Dharma to the letter. Because, question mark around Draupadi and whether or not she, did he lose himself before, all of that notwithstanding. But during Kurukshetra itself, I found that the Pandavas were more guilty of these little lapses in dharma. For example, there is moral ambiguity around Krishna, Arjuna killing Karna when he was down. Whereas Krishna, of course, says, reminds him of all that Karna had done and basically eggs him on. I mean, it says, go ahead and do that, whatever. And then there is the Yudhishthira episode where he technically Ashwathama the elephant.
Ashwathama and the elephant.
Yeah, exactly. So there were these lapses, but before that, they were absolutely blameless. I mean, because they were on that path of dharma, that's why they ended up going, doing the Vanavasa, and then the Virata Parva happens. And I just think it's ironic that, and that's a beautiful ambiguity of the Mahabharata, that nobody is really blamelessly on the path of dharma or dharma.
I agree with you entirely. And I think if we're looking for an ideal depiction, we're looking at the wrong Sanskrit epic. That's why I love the Mahabharata, because it's just like us, Yeah, but I do agree with what you're saying. It is problematic, but then here we are. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jay. Thank you. That was absolutely enchanting. I have very simple questions. You mentioned that Karna and Vidura are your favorite characters. I'd love to hear more about, especially Karna's side of what your perspective is. And more importantly, what happened to Sushmi after the mango was eaten? I'd love to hear about that battle, or where we can read about it.
gosh, I thought we were going to slide by that one. Yes, what happened to Sushmi? I mean, okay, I had like 7 or 8 pages here to read, and that's what I did. But Sushmi was eventually killed in the war, but and defeated. But I didn't get into that part of it. And it's like it would have taken me another 8 or 10 pages to read it, and this is what we had time for. But yes, Sushmi does lose in the end, but there's so much that we wouldn't recognize from the classical Mahabharata in this Gadwali one. I have a list here on my computer, which I have here, of the 172 episodes in which I've color coded the list of episodes by how close or remote or identical or distant they happen to be from the so-called original Mahabharata, which was the Sanskrit one. And but there's a lot of like battles, but the battles are fought with flowers. A lot of flower battles they throw at each other, and that's why I say it's fun. And as far as why I prefer Vidura and Karna, because both of them acted with the greatest nobility in the epic. You could complain that Karna maybe didn't so much, but he did, in my view. And he was, he was killed because Krishna said, the only way we're going to get this guy is if we get him while he's changing his tire. Okay, and Vidura was also the half brother of Yudhishthira. He was also a manifestation of Dharma. And when he died, I don't know if any of you can remember the story of Vidura's passing, but I can just tell it in 10 easy words or less. Let's see. Dhritarashtra and Gandhari had gone to the forest to take up their sannyas ashram. They were accompanied up there by Yudhishthira and hundreds of soldiers. So they had their little kutir, and they were going to live in that kutir forever. Gandhari was blind. Yudhishthira was old, and Yudhishthira goes to Dhritarashtra and says, Dhritarashtra, where is Vidura? Where is Vidura? Where has he gone? And you hear way out echoing in the distant forest, it is me, it's Vidura. So they look around and they couldn't find him anywhere. And finally, there was Vidura, looking like a skeleton, starving himself, leaning up against a tree. And Yudhishthira says, "Oh, there you are. There's my brother. There's my other half. There's the other half of Dharma. It is there. It is you." And he's standing there, green, leaning up against a tree, just about to die. And then suddenly he drops dead, and the spirit of Vidura joins with the spirit of Yudhishthira. And how does the spirit join? In the same way we've seen in that possession episode. His eyes meet his eyes, his hands meet his hands, his heart meets his heart. The two, there's this really vivid and detailed recollection of the parts of the body that come together, which you see in a lot of other places in Upanishads and even in Gadwali performance, Pandav Leela performance in Gadwal. So anyway, that's noble characters. You can search for noble characters. You can see them in Ramayana with, the way they're depicted is explicitly to bring about that point. But in Mahabharata, it's almost kind of accidental, like that. Okay, next.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for your talk and sharing your thoughts and experience. It was a real pleasure listening to you today. Early in the when you started speaking, you mentioned that the Sanskrit text was one of many, and then you said more recent cultural phenomena are being integrated into it. Could you give an example or two of of these Mahabharata which integrate more recent cultural phenomena?
Yes. One Mahabharata that has been, regional Mahabharata that has been studied closely was by Alf Hiltebeitel, who looked at the Draupadi Mahabharata in North Arcot district of Tamil Nadu, with stretches into parts of Karnataka. And there we have all kinds of modern phenomena that come into it. And some of the characters are just completely transformed. Like Arjuna happens to be this weakling who's consigned to sitting up in a tree. And Draupadi is the strong one who's the leader of the armies. And so there's that kind of stretch that comes into it. And in the Garhwali Mahabharata, in fact, we have a lot of issues of modernity. I mean, there's discussion of cars and, you know, electricity. That sort of stuff has come into it also. You know, if I can't remember the exact context, but if Arjuna is having trouble, then turn on the lights. You know, that kind of thing. Just, but this is the updating of this. This happens everywhere in the world. You have the updating of stories. I mean, where I'm from in the U.S., in the U.S. Southwest, in the state of New Mexico and Arizona, where there's a lot of modern stuff built into the old Hopi creation myths and so on. I mean, it's a phenomenon that happens everywhere. If we trace any kind of historical development of a story into modernity, that's going to happen. That's absolutely going to happen, and I can cite a lot of examples of that within India and elsewhere. And in Maharashtra, you have the the annual Varkari pilgrimage from Alandi to Pandharpur, and even with that, because you know this goes back to when it was, you know, Jnaneshwar in the 12th century, but there's been a lot of elements into that yatra in the month of July, which also are decisively modern, and I've seen them and looked at this stuff and thought, whoa, they didn't do this in Jnaneshwar's time, and so we do have this phenomenon, and it's perfectly fine. We don't have to strive to get back to an archetypal original that meets our conception of what it might look like. You know, after all, how many of us expected in this Garhwali story that Arjuna would be sent to Sri Lanka to get a mango, and then Hanuman would appear? You know, so all of this. Yeah, you had a question here.
Yeah, my question is also about this idea of authorship and the collective ownership of a text. And the Mahabharata as a text has been retold so many times and through so many generations. There are textual versions of it that exist, but there are also these momentary oral performances, and each oral performance is very different, even if it's in the same tradition. So how do we understand that idea of is there such a in the Indic tradition, can we even think of a singular text or a pure text or a canonical text, or do we have to think of of all of these different things interacting in a different model of a text? I think what you just also talked about, the version in North Arcot, and the Garhwali version, they're also kind of more communal. But we also see the same text being appropriated for like almost state propaganda. If you go to like Angkor Wat, and you see those kinds of the Mahabharata there. So I'm also curious on how this is a very confusing question, but how do you see that model of a text? Can we think of it in a much more plural way? And how do we reconcile? What are the different threads you see? The different kinds of ownership, whether it's state, whether it's community, whether it's yeah.
I get back to A.K. Ramanujan's statement. Nobody has ever heard the Mahabharata for the first time, and which certainly you ask anybody in this room, when was the last time you heard the Mahabharata for the first time? You know, it's like, doesn't happen like that. So there's always going to be this evolution of stories. I mean, it's not, you know, people really are looking for fixity. They're looking for stability. They're looking for definitiveness, you know, but we're just not going to find it. And if you think that you're going to find it, then good luck. That's all I can say. I won't say you won't find it. I'll just say good luck. And but you know, if we look for any story, you know, we're get back to an archetypal original. You know, it's just, I mean, how far back are you going to go? If you go back as far as the Rig Veda, that's about as far back as you can go, without knowing anything about what came out of people's mouths during the Indus Valley times. You know, third millennium BCE. You're just not. We don't know. We wish we did. But we can see certain very advanced cultures at that time, you know, buried sewer systems and so on. So we knew that there was a lot going on there, and we wish we could answer those questions. But when we get back to the earliest, like Vedic cultures, for example, which kind of maybe melted into the Mahabharata, Ramayana cultures, we see that there was no stability, that there was that there was always change, that things were, even within the Vedas, even with the Rig Veda itself, it's 10,000 verses or mantras within that, you know, 1,028 hymns of the Rig Veda. And you can even, you know, date those at different times. And, you know, certain scholars have been doing that for the last, 40 years, dating parts of the Rig Veda and by linguistic reconstruction and so on. But I do feel that the closer we look to any religious or historical text, the more we can deconstruct it into evolutionary parts of it. I don't know. Yeah. I don't think I'm getting to your answering your question very much.
I usually think that I'm loud enough to be heard across, but I was saying part of the fascination of the Mahabharata as a modern reader is stuff which goes, you know, unremarked in the main text. For example, you know, when we were discussing earlier that the Pandavas followed Dharma to the T before the war started or something of that sort. Now, when I think about the Mahabharata, you think about the Lakshagraha, where, you know, a family of 5 is slaughtered, take the place of the Pandavas, and so that the Kauravas think that they've been eliminated. Or remarking about disability, you know, when Duryodhana enters the palace for the first time. So, you know, stuff like that always invites a discussion of what Dharma is and whether the Pandavas were following it. I was wondering, you know, in all the scholarship that has gone on in the Mahabharata, say, from the times it was composed, were people reacting to it based on their times? You know, someone who was living in 1100 or 1200 writing about the Mahabharata, did he find something problematic, or is it all just, you know, modern takes on the Mahabharata?
Okay, yeah, yes, I understand your question. Well, because the Mahabharata is really responsible for so much of Sanskrit literature and, you know, vernacular literature. For example, we have, you know, the plays by Bhasa, Urubhangam, or you know, Kalidasa, Shakuntala out of the Mahabharata. So yes, there have always been local responses to it, and you see even in certain, you know, dramatic texts. And remember that Sanskrit drama, well, after about the third, well, even with Kalidasa, end of the 4th century, like 350, 375 CE, you'll see there are sections that are written in Prakrit and sections that are written in Sanskrit, and you have sometimes 2 or 3 Prakrit dialects that are there. And you wonder who could understand this, who could watch this play in the 5th century and understand all these dialects that were being spoken. And we have to assume that they were able to understand it. At least some audiences were able to understand it. So yeah, so they, you know, if you look at certain dramas, I'm thinking of the, well, one I actually had my students perform one year by a playwright called Mahendra Varman from the Pallava dynasty, and written about the year beginning of the 7th century, like 610, 620 CE, where who wrote these comedies, these comic plays, Matavilasa, Prahasanam, and so on, where there were these characters that were just, you know, skewering each other, making fun of each other. And there were all these Mahabharata and Ramayana references throughout these, you know, these plays, but they were being skewered. They were being, you know, they were kidding around. You know, to them it was they were joking around with these things, and this was already in the 6th century. Okay, 500 years after the Mahabharata, but still they developed this kind of sophistication, this kind of humor, and then there's like a lot of deadly things too, you know. I mean, if you look at the there's this phenomenon in North India, in Garhwal mostly, called the Pandav Leela. Almost nobody's ever heard of the Pandav Leela. You hear of the Ram Leela, we hear of the Krishna Leela, but nobody hears about the Pandav Leela. It's because it's up in Garhwal, a little bit in Kumaon, but mostly in Garhwal, where you have these multi-day performances. They go for anywhere from 10 to 17 days, and they're always in December, and it's always cold. And the reason it's in December is because that's when there's nothing going on agriculturally, and there's people come back for that time of year because they want to see these performances. They come from if they're up in Garhwal, they come from, you know, from Bombay or Dehradun or Ambala or Dubai, wherever they happen to live, and they come up to their villages for these performances. And the performances are Mahabharata performances, but they are all kind of costumed, and these people get into these states of possession and they actually become the character that they depict, whether it's Arjuna or Bhima or Kunti or Draupadi. Those are just the main characters in these things. But in the end, there's always this incredible mock sacrifice. But what is being sacrificed? What is the animal that's being sacrificed maximally? Because this whole Pandav Leela is a shraddha, and the animal that's being sacrificed in the end is, any ideas? It's a genda. A genda is a rhinoceros. How about that? And of course, there are no rhinoceri up there. But there were, according to naturalists, there were like 250,000 rhinoceri between about Haridwar and the Tarai in about the year 1775. The last rhinoceros was killed in the year 1843 up in those parts. But there were hundreds of thousands of them. We can't even imagine what the ecology looked like. We can't even imagine how ecology and characterization and drama and Mahabharata, Ramayana, how that all interacted in civilization when the ecology and the fauna and the flora were so different just a few hundred years ago. But we do know that there's, you know, when we see this kind of mock Genda rhinoceros sacrifice at the end of a Pandav Leela, it's a really striking thing. I have some videos of them. And it's, you know, they make this big this rhinoceros out of a large kuddu and put ears on it and legs and all these things, and then everybody gets into a state of possession, and then Bhima comes and slaughters this big kuddu rhinoceros, and it's great fun. But these are the kinds of things that modern additions into it. I mean, where are you going to get this? They put leaves for the ears and poles for the legs, that kind of. But it's all very different. It's just really different. We have stuff in this country that we can't even imagine it. It's so related to everything, but so different. Yeah. Here. Yes.
Hi, many thanks for the fascinating talk. I traveled quite a bit, some 30 odd kilometers to attend this talk. And after listening to your Sushmit story, I thought it was worth it.
Yeah.
And later I checked Google. Google doesn't have it. So well done. So my question regarding various versions of Mahabharata you have read, is there any consistency in the portrayal of female characters like Gandhari, Kunti, and Draupadi?
Yes.
Thank you.
Kunti is always depicted, which means that there must be a place where she's not depicted like this. But in my experience, she's always depicted with a great sense of dignity and a great sense of responsibility on her shoulders. She, after all, is the mother of these Pandavas, three of them anyway, and so she has a heavy load on her shoulders always. She's always depicted as being very grave, and Draupadi is depicted kind of differently, I would say, because I've seen the performances in North Arcot and in Garhwal, and Draupadi is a very different character. In the South Indian Garhwali, rather Tamil version, where Draupadi leads the people in a firewalking ceremony. At the very end is a firewalking ceremony where Draupadi leads the troops across this big bed of burning coals. So she's a very heroic character there. In the Garhwali Mahabharata, she's a major character. And there was a person who was playing the role of Draupadi in some of these Pandav Leelas for at least 40 years. Very old now, but you could see that Draupadi was right there, I mean, she would get into this role of Draupadi, and Draupadi would be right there. She was so. I mean, I've seen these people who are, and I've known them in my own village up in the Himalaya. It's called Sangrali, where these people have spent so much of their lives in states of possession. They don't even know who they are anymore. Are they Draupadi or are they somebody else? And but I see that much more distinctly a facet of self-conception in the Garhwali Mahabharata than I saw in Tamil Nadu or in Maharashtra. But but there's a fluidity of selfhood. I mean, are you somebody from the district and village, or are you Draupadi? Are you somebody from the district, or are you, Kunti, or Arjuna? Because these people, they really see that they are these other periods and other time places. One of the things that dragged me up to the Himalaya in the first place, when I started translating this text for Chicago's series, and I moved up to Kausani, which is north of Almora, about 50 kilometers north of Almora, kind of right below Nanda Devi and Trishula, these big high mountains. And what I discovered was that every place name, every village, every community, every clan had a Mahabharata name to it. So I started tracking, and I started making a list of these kind of contiguous levels of historical geography that all came together. And I could trace like 3 levels of geography and how they transmitted these knowledge of geography through these small local pilgrimages, where the deity was moving around on a dolly or a swing, a palki, being carried around to like 18 little villages. And then there would be these networks. I tried tracing out some of these networks, these pilgrimage networks that tied together the different geographical layers that people conceived that they lived in. Then I realized that this is a project for like 50 researchers and would take 100 years. But I experienced enough of it to know that people really do live these different levels of geographical presence, the mythic levels, the physical levels, the different ethereal levels, and the talk of the ethereal beings that populate these different levels are very real to these people. It's not that they're stupid or anything. It's just that they understand the construction of reality, of their own physical reality, to be multi-tiered like that. And it's kind of amazing. I wish I had another couple of lifetimes to research all of this. Well, probably I do, but maybe I don't. I don't know. Gandhari. Yes, Gandhari does figure into all of this. I didn't bring my timepiece at all, shut it. So,
That's fine.
so Gandhari is also a major character in the Garhwali Mahabharata, because we have Gandhari there together with Yudhishthira. I'm sorry, with Dhritarashtra, and that's a big scene there. The blind Gandhari, and there's a character who is possessed by the spirit of Gandhari also in this.
Fred, that was fascinating. Not just the different versions of the Mahabharata, but you made it seem as if it's a field that envelopes all of us. You set alight the Mahabharatas within ourselves and riveting, really. Thank you so much. Thanks also to the BIC organizers for hosting this wonderful event, and to Bhavachana Deepa and her team for partnering with Rujuvatu and making this possible, and for this lovely morning with such beautiful stories that permeate this culture, this great culture. Thank you, Fred.